Hello, wonderful podcast listeners and watchers. If you're watching this on YouTube, really excited to bring you another video podcast. Since it's getting to be the holiday time, we just had a day to spend thinking about what we're grateful for and giving thanks. And we're just getting into December and January, a time full of all these holidays. Thought it might be fun to spend a little bit of time thinking about somebody that might not remind you of the holiday, but I've been speaking about a lot lately, and that's Richard III. You'll see Richard up here on the little Christmas tree. There's a new Christmas tree, Richard III ornament I picked up at the National Archives. And I just thought, what would it be like to have a medieval style Christmas in the heart of court battles for power? Course, all these people were not ever in the same place at the same time, but I thought it would be interesting. Family was so important to Richard III, and it might be kind of fun to think about it in terms of a great big family gathering for the holiday. So join me, travel with me as we celebrate the family holidays, medieval style, featuring the family of Richard III. So, my clicker's not working. Hang on, let me just do it this way then. All right. So if you imagine a holiday dinner with Richard III, family was just so important to him. We don't often think about him as a family man, but the York family played a huge part in the history of England and in the history of the monarchy in particular. And Richard was a part of that. He was a key part of that. And other members of his family were as well. And so I'm looking at this through the lens of Richard and his family and how his family sort of contributed to him becoming the man and the king that he was. Now, all of this family idea is especially different and a little hard to imagine when your family business is running the country. So it's not just that everybody's working for the same family business. It is that it's the highest stakes in the land. It is running the country. Now, long before the York family made a play for the crown, they were in the inner circles of the monarchy. And that's the story we're looking at today. How did the York family get in there? Why were they there? When did they make a play for the crown? And how does Richard fit into that picture along with so many other people? We're starting with Edward III, quite important and famous king, along with his wife, Philippa. She ruled for 40 and he ruled for 50 years. It was a very long reign, which did create a stabilizing force. He came to the throne young. He was chivalric. He was a warrior. He was very successful, at least early on, in defeating the French. And he and Philippa had a large family, including 5 sons who lived to adulthood. So he was clicking all those boxes of a medieval king. And his sons, his surviving sons, were Prince Edward, of course, named for Edward. Then sometimes he was called the Black Prince. His nickname may have come from blacking, putting black on his armor so it wouldn't reflect the sun. It may also have come, apparently he was quite a ruthless and cruel warrior, and so he may have had sort of a black reputation. But in any case, Black Prince is Prince Edward, who is the heir. Then there is Lionel, Duke of Clarence. John of Gaunt, he's very important, becomes Duke of Lancaster. Edmund, the Duke of York. So here's where we're really going to start our York family tree, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. And it's through him that we get the Staffords and the Buckinghams that are so important. So these are really the core families at the time, and they all are descended from royalty, starting with Edward III. The problem for Edward in terms of his great succession plan is that his eldest son, Prince Edward, the heir, the Black Prince, died before his father. And the throne doesn't then pass to the next son of Edward III, but rather to Prince Edward's son, who was a child. This is a problem in a time of war, where strong king equals strong country. When a 10-year-old comes to the throne, it can be a problem. And that was the case with Richard II. Now, we had all those uncles, the other sons of Edward III, who were around him and helping him, but they tended to sometimes have different ideas. Richard himself had sort of a moment of glory during the Peasants' Revolt, when he was successfully able to demonstrate his decisiveness and his courage and his physical strength. And he took all that press and all the congratulations he got quite seriously, went to his head. and began to really lean into the idea that he was king and everybody should just do what he said. He ran into trouble with Parliament as he began to surround himself with favorites who were very unpopular with some of the Parliament and some of the noble leaders of the land. And Parliament insisted that Richard put away and, in fact, executed some of his great supporters and those who were closest to him. Richard did seem to be going along with that for a while, but eventually, as the 1390s went on, he began to take revenge against those who had worked against him, against the Lords Appellant, ultimately executing some. And he ends up banishing or sending into exile the son of John of Gaunt. So his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, is sent into exile. He's not found guilty of anything. He's not tried, but he is sent into exile, banished, sent away. When John of Gaunt dies, Henry Bolingbroke assumes he will now inherit. He will become the Duke. He will inherit all of that land and be the Duke of Lancaster. Instead, Richard seizes it for himself. Bolingbroke returns and insists that everything be returned to him that is coming to him by law. The other nobles become a little concerned. If Richard can take John of Gaunt's lands, what about theirs? So it turns out that Parliament and Bolingbroke all combine and force Richard II, an anointed king, to abdicate. They depose him, and the end of his reign is 1399. Now, Bolingbroke is not exactly next in line, but the next thing you know, he becomes Henry IV. He takes the throne in 1399 as Henry IV. He comes to the throne, interestingly enough, with a large family. He has sons. He has a succession plan baked right in. And his sons are Henry, John, Humphrey. He also has a couple of daughters, Blanche and Philippa. And through this, he is able to demonstrate he's got the succession taken care of. He can marry his children and form alliances internationally, domestically, increase his power base, increase his power network by using his family and expanding his family in that way. And that was a fairly typical thing to do. Now, there were those who didn't think the Lancaster family should be on the throne. This is where we get the Lancastrians, because Bolingbroke did become Duke of Lancaster. Not everybody agreed with that, because there were other heirs that were ahead of him if you looked strictly at the succession. And so he continued to have to put down rebellions and deal with challenges to his throne. When he died in 1413, he was quite easily succeeded by his son, also named Henry, who became Henry V. Now, Henry V was a wildly popular king. He, like his great-grandfather, Edward III, really ticked all the boxes of a great medieval king. He was charming. He was chivalric. He was a warrior. He defeated the French, Agincourt and Harfleur. He gained the French princess as part of that. And in a treaty, it was decided and determined and agreed that his son, of course, he'll have a son, he's King Henry V, will not only be King of England, but King of France as well. Not everyone was supportive of Henry V, and that included the York family, Richard, the Duke of Cambridge. He supported instead Edmund Mortimer and was part of the Southampton plot to depose Henry V and put Edmund Mortimer on the throne. See, this idea, once you depose Richard II and you start deciding, oh, we can determine who ought to be the king, it's a hard door to close once you've opened it. Well, Henry V knew that he had to really firmly close that door, that there could be any question about him being the king. And so Richard of Cambridge and others were executed for treason. This brought into the York family a bit of a shadow. I mean, being executed for treason is not a good thing. Fortunately for them, the whole family was not attainted, and the Dukedom of York remained with Richard of Cambridge's brother. And eventually, when his brother didn't have children, it passed to Richard of Cambridge's son, who became Richard, the Duke of York. Now, we have many people named Richard over the next little while, and I will try and differentiate them. Richard, Duke of York, was only 3 when his father was executed, and he became a ward of the king and was sent to live with the Earl of Westmoreland as his charge. The Neville family were strong supporters at that time of the House of Lancaster, And you see, as the Duke of York is taken in as a ward, and of course, that often means that your ward will marry one of your daughters. And that's what the Earl of Westmoreland had in mind. And that is, in fact, what happened. So Richard, Duke of York, grew up with this family and married, yes, one of the daughters. He married Cecily. And so these two brought together the family of Neville with the House of York. And it wasn't just Cecily, although she's extremely important on her own. Other members of her family included the Earl of Salisbury, also named Richard, and the Earl of Warwick, also named Richard. So it just was really an important time for the York family to be making these alliances. Interestingly enough, Cecily is the daughter of Joan Beaufort. And Joan Beaufort is the daughter through Catherine Swynford of John of Gaunt. So there's royal blood here too through the Beaufort line. The Beauforts are very important. Many of the Beauforts are directly, of course, related to the Lancastrian. John of Gaunt actually had a Lancastrian family. When he was married to Blanche of Lancaster, then he married Constance of Castile, and then he married Catherine Swynford. She'd been his mistress for a while. The children were already born, but they're legitimized later. So there are all kinds of tangled relationships going on here. And the Nevilles do descend through Beauforts. And so those alliances become really interesting. The Beaufort family is quite split once we get to the Wars of the Roses and beyond. So Cecily and Richard, Duke of York, are married. They become the Duke and Duchess of York. And as you see, I know this is way too many words for a slide, but as you see, they have many children. They have a very big family. Some of their children die young. That's not uncommon at the time, but they have Anne, who survives. They have Edward, Edmund, Elizabeth, Margaret, George, and Richard. All of these children live into adulthood and are significant. These are just names that really matter. These are names that really change the history going forward. So it's important to remember at this point, York has aligned with Neville, which comes from Beaufort. So there's a lot of royal blood coursing through these coursing through these veins, because they don't think they have enough power. Richard, Duke of York, is determined to have more power. Now, the Wheel of Fortune, which is a really big symbol at the time because power changes, fortunes change, people die, people change sides just at the drop of a hat. And it just seems like it's very hard to ever really be on firm ground. And this is the environment that our Richard, who will become Richard III, this is what he grows up in, an environment where things change rapidly, where there's never enough power or never enough security because someone else probably has his eye on what you have. So Richard is born in 1452 in the midst of amazing times, because we now have, and I know this is a very stylized, I love this image, but I know it's very stylized, Wars of the Roses with plucking red and plucking white roses, of course, all made up, and a Shakespearean version of it. But the idea that the factions at court, there are Beauforts at court, there are Lancastrian supporters at court, there are Yorkist supporters, there are Nevilles, there are Percys, there are all these people at court. Henry V has died. His son became Henry VI as an infant. And Henry VI, even though he is an adult by this time, is unable to manage the factions at court. He just holds the people close to him who agree with him and make him feel good, and rumbling and power struggles are happening all around. And eventually these erupt in war. So in 1455, when Richard is only 3 years old, he is at his family home as his father is assembling an army, and the Earl of Salisbury's there with him, and Earl of Warwick's there, and all of these soldiers. I mean, just imagine being a young boy watching all this happen. And amazingly enough, there are some early Yorkist victories and a lot of celebrations in the family. In the First Battle of St. Albans, the Yorkists win. They defeat the king's forces, and it looks like Richard, Duke of York, who is demanding a high and important position at court, will be successful. Things are looking good. And yet, battles go on and things get bad. And by 1459, the royal troops very soundly defeat the Yorkists. And as the royal army is swelling, Richard, Duke of York, and his son Edward, and his son Edmund, who are fighting along beside him, and the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Warwick, those are the leaders of the Yorkist cause. And they realize that they will be defeated, and they decide to leave. So they flee the country. They leave their troops behind. And of course, without their leaders, the Yorkist troops just fall apart, and the Lancastrians achieve a very firm victory because they're left behind. The troops are left behind. And it's not just the troops that are left behind. In fact, Richard also leaves his wife, Cecily, and his younger children behind. And so here is a time we see George and Richard, those two younger sons, who are together, left with their mother. They're in sort of a gentle custody with the Duchess of Buckingham, but they realize that their father has left them, and they're sort of on their own, and things are not, they're okay, but they're not great. So Richard is experiencing all of this as he grows up. But the very next year, his father and the troops all return and continue to fight. And it is this point in 1460 that the Duke of York says, it's not enough for me anymore to have a position at court. I should actually be on the throne. My claim to the throne is stronger than the Lancastrian claim, and I want to be on the throne. Now, this doesn't go over really well, even with his own supporters. They think that's a bit too far, but he is able to, with the forces of Lancaster and the support of the king to some degree. The king by this time isn't actively involved in everything. Henry VI has a number of mental breakdowns and is not necessarily really in charge of things, but his leaders agree to an act of accord whereby the York forces will stop fighting, and Henry VI will remain on the throne until his death. And then Richard, Duke of York, will be his heir and will be the next king. Now, the problem is Henry VI has a family, and his wife, Margaret of Anjou, and their son are not too happy with this idea that Richard, Duke of York, has just replaced the prince, the heir, as the heir. So Marguerite's forces continue to fight, and she rallies the Lancastrian forces. And that same year in 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, Richard, Duke of York, is killed. And it's a shattering moment for the York family. I mean, does that mean, is that the end of it? Edmund, his son, his second eldest son, is also killed. So you do still have his son, Edward, but I mean, Edward's only barely 18. Is he really equipped to carry on his father's battle? And the forces are routed, and Salisbury is also killed. And it just really doesn't look good. And Cecily decides at this point, okay, wait, this is really bad here. And so she takes Richard, her sons, Richard and George. Richard is 8, George is 11, and sends them to Burgundy for their safety, because she knows the Lancastrians are coming fast and furious. Now that they've killed Richard, Duke of York, the rest of the family is in grave danger. The Lancastrians are really trying to finish him off. Even so, things are about to change, because Edward decides he will take up his father's battle and he will move forward. So let's take a moment. We're in 1460. I know he was not this old. He's only 8 years old. We just don't have any images of him. But now is when I really want to start looking at the family of Richard, who will soon become Duke of Gloucester. He's not quite there yet, but things are really going to change for him. Imagine him at 8. He and his brother and a couple of servants have sort of been sent off to Burgundy. The Duke of Burgundy doesn't really want him close by because he's harboring fugitives. And so he sends them way away from court. I mean, this is his life at this age. This is how he's growing and learning and really being on the run. And it's very difficult. And yet what we find is that only a few months later, Edward, fighting alongside Warwick, the Kingmaker, is successful, and his brother becomes the King of England. So he's brought back from Burgundy, and now the Duke of Burgundy is like, whoa, come to court. I'm really happy to have you here. He participates in 1461, less than a year later that he's been sent away. He's part of the coronation. His brother's crowned King of England. He becomes Duke of Gloucester. So Edward plays a really important role. There are records of Edward visiting his two brothers when they return from Burgundy and being almost a father figure. He is their brother, but he's quite a bit older. And with their father now dead, he is the head of the family and sort of acts as a father figure. You'll notice that Edward has two reigns. He reigns from this victory in 1461 until 1470, at which time members of his own family rise up against him to put the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, back on the throne, which happens in 1470. Edward, at that point, at 1470, when he flees the country again, sort of a habit of Edward's, he takes Richard with him. By 1470, Richard is one of his greatest supporters and greatest warriors. The two of them return in 1471. Richard and Edward, fighting alongside each other, regain Edward's throne, and Edward then reigns until 1483. We'll talk about what happens then in a minute. But let's look at some of the other people involved. Here is the Kingmaker. Now, he's really important in Edward IV's life and then in Richard's life. So when Richard, Duke of York, is killed and Salisbury is killed, Edward is left at almost just barely 18 to take up the cause. It is his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, who is his mentor, who fights by his side, who helps him win the battles, gets him on the throne, and helps him establish his rule. And so the Kingmaker is very important to Edward and rules alongside of him, has tremendous power. And in fact, really enjoys having all that power and pulling the strings and really telling the king what to do. Early in Edward's first reign, Richard actually goes to live with Warwick, and Warwick is one of the main instructors in terms of Richard learning to be a chivalric knight and learning to be a warrior and becoming such a strategist in battle. A lot of that he gets from living with Warwick. Well, as time goes on, Warwick is seeking more and more control, and Edward IV is becoming a little tired of it. Warwick in particular really likes the French. They flatter him, and so he wants to arrange a French marriage for King Edward. Edward decides he wants to choose his own bride and does so. Warwick, for that and other reasons, is one of those who rises up, surprisingly, against Edward IV and goes to fight for the forces of Henry VI. So that idea of Kingmaker, he then puts Henry VI. So he's already put Edward on the throne. He then fights to put Henry VI back on the throne. At that point, obviously, Richard has been pulled from Warwick's household and is fighting alongside his brother against both of their former mentors. And eventually the Kingmaker is killed in battle when Edward retakes the throne. But he's a very important force in Richard's life. So who is it that Edward marries? Edward marries Elizabeth Woodville and brings Elizabeth and all of the Woodvilles into the royal family. These are the royal in-laws, the Woodville family. Now, Warwick's plan is to marry Edward IV, a young king who's taken the throne in battle. England's not in an incredibly strong position at this time, but with the support of the French, with wealth and prestige from marrying a French princess, Warwick thinks he can really shore up support for Edward and his legacy. Edward's not having it. He marries an English woman. She's not just a commoner. She's, in fact, the widow of a man who fought for the Lancastrians. So she has all kinds of reasons working against why Edward would choose to marry her and make her the queen. But supposedly he loved her so much and she refused to sleep with him until he married her. So here she is, Elizabeth Woodville, who brings not a foreign support, not a foreign army, but in fact a family who wants advantageous marriages, positions at court, and allows Edward to create his own network with the Woodvilles. And so now he has a lot of alliances that do not include his York family. And there is some enmity right from the start between the Woodvilles and the rest of the York family, and that will continue. Now, Edward and Richard have an important sister. They have other sisters, but Margaret is one of the most important sisters because she marries the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, and strengthens this alliance with Burgundy, which turns out to be very important for Edward and for Richard during their reigns. And also, Margaret is one of the strong York supporters even after the reign of Richard III ends and we move into the reign of Henry VII. Henry is so upset with Margaret, who very generously and forcefully supports the challengers to the reign of Henry VII. So Henry VII continues to have problems with Margaret. She is perhaps the last of the Yorkists fighting for the Yorkist cause. And so she's a very important member of this family. Now, once Richard returns and Edward's back on the throne, he wants to get married and he decides to marry Anne Neville. George isn't thrilled about that. George is married to Anne's sister Isabel, and the Nevilles, whoa, money and land there. And George, Richard and Edward's brother, wants it all. But in fact, Edward supports Richard's desire to marry Anne. And so Richard does marry Anne Neville in 1472. This provides Richard an opportunity to start his own dynasty. Now he has a wife, he can have children, he's getting more and more recognition from Edward. He has all this authority in the north and all this land, and he is establishing his own power base. It's very important to have a wife and children to do that. And so this is a really important step for Richard. Now, the other brother, the one who's not Edward the King, is George, the Duke of Clarence. This is a really complicated relationship. These three brothers, Edward the King, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard has been strongly supportive of Edward in all of his campaigns. George, on the other hand, is one of those who, along with the Earl of Warwick, changed sides and actually fought on the side that was attempting to put Henry VI back on the throne. Now, George realized he'd made a mistake and begged his brother, King Edward, for forgiveness, and Edward did forgive him. Apparently, Cecily, the mom, Margaret, one of the sisters, and Richard were very involved in reconciling the two brothers. But Edward does allow George to come back to court. But George's behavior continues to be pretty erratic. When his wife, Isabel, dies, first of all, he decides he wants to marry Mary of Burgundy, who is the stepdaughter of his sister, Margaret. The last thing Edward wants is George to have that kind of authority in Burgundy. So he says no. George is furious. And then he keeps thinking about his wife dying and decides that she must have been killed deliberately. So he hunts down one of the women who attended his wife at the birth of their child, which is how she died, arrests her, sets up a mock trial, and has her executed, all just on his own without any authority. That's a huge challenge to the king's authority. You can't have people just going off and holding trials and executing people. And it's especially a problem if it's the king's brother. So for this and other reasons, George is directly challenging his brother's authority. Eventually, he's arrested. He is thrown into the tower. He is tried and found guilty. It's quite interesting that it is Edward himself who is the prosecutor at George's trial. So there's no chance he's going to be found innocent. Possibly, according to legend, he was executed by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. We don't know if that's true, but in any case, he was privately executed at the Tower of London. And so Richard has seen these two brothers fight, disagree, reconcile, and then turn violently and fatally against each other. And Richard, again, front row seat for all of it. Now, all this is sort of holding together. The other couple of family members that are very important are in our story are the nephews. So Edward IV has some daughters, and then he has two sons, Edward and Richard. This is Paul de la Roche. It's a very Victorian painting of the two boys sort of cowering there in the tower with their little dog trying to protect them. Um, Edward's son, Edward, is the heir to the throne. Everyone assumes that he will take the throne. Richard is, at least during Edward's reign, seems fine with that. The Woodville family, in particular, Elizabeth Woodville's brother, is the head of Prince Edward's household. So the Woodvilles are very ingrained with Edward's sons, and this does become a problem in 1483. In the spring of 1483, although he is a young man, Edward IV becomes very ill, and it looks like he will not make it. And so he starts frantically making arrangements and says that Richard, who's Duke of Gloucester, should be the Lord Protector, and that Earl Rivers, that's Woodville, Elizabeth Woodville's brother, should have the person of the king in his charge and continue to run the new king's household when Edward V becomes king. So I'm just going to read you some dates here so you can see how quickly things change. And looking at these two boys, think of that. So on the 9th of April, this is 1483, on the 9th of April, Edward IV dies. On the 16th, Richard is informed that the king is dead. Now, Edward V, who's at Ludlow, so Richard's up north, Edward V's at Ludlow, they're not in London. It's not like you can just send a quick text. It takes days to get the message out. So on the 23rd of April, Richard leaves York to head to London. And on the 24th, Earl Rivers, who's in charge of Edward V's household, and Richard Grey leave with Edward. They come together on April 30th, and Richard says to Woodville, let's all go to London together. And they seem to have a really good dinner. And then the next morning, Richard has Woodville, Earl Rivers, and Henry Grey arrested, and he takes custody of the young king to take him to London. Now, Elizabeth Woodville hears about this. So she now knows her brother and her son from her first marriage have been arrested by Richard, and Richard has custody of her other son, who's the king. And so this is when Elizabeth takes her family and goes into sanctuary. On the 4th of May, Richard and Edward arrive in London, and Richard announces that he will delay the date of Edward's coronation until the 22nd of June. Richard is acting as Lord Protector at this time. He's officially pronounced Lord Protector on the 8th of May. And I saw a document when I was at the archives that he had signed on the 19th of May as Edward's Lord Protector. And so he was acting in that capacity. Interestingly, on that day also, Edward enters the Tower of London. Now, that isn't necessarily a frightening thing because Edward is preparing for his coronation, and many monarchs spend a few days before their coronation in the Tower. It was a royal apartment. We think of it as just a prison, and during the reign of Henry VIII, it became a very terrifying place. But previously, it was often used as a royal apartment. So it's not yet quite as ominous as it becomes. So again, we're working toward a June 22nd coronation for Edward. Richard, his brother, is brought to the Tower to be with him. And in early June, some of Richard's inner circle seems to be arguing. Hastings and Buckingham are now battling with each other, and Hastings is summoned to a council meeting and executed on the spot without a trial, which gives pause to some people. And on the 17th of June, so coronation is supposed to be the 5th of the 22nd of June, 5 days later, on the 17th of June, Richard announces that the coronation will be delayed a few more days. On the 22nd of June, there is a sermon preached that claims that Edward IV had not legally been married to Elizabeth Woodville, which means all of their children are illegitimate and ineligible for the throne. And in fact, Richard needs to be king. And on the 26th of June, Richard took the throne as King of England. And on the 6th of July, he is crowned alongside his wife, Anne Neville. So imagine you are the nephews, you're Edward and Richard in the Tower, and you hear all of the commotion. The Tower is used as part of the coronation. and it's not yours. Edward thought it would be his, and it wasn't. It's actually Richard's. And so the households of the princes are disbanded from the Tower, and we do not know what happened to them. There are all kinds of rumors. That's probably a story for another day. But in the meanwhile, Richard and Anne head up north. They are king and queen. They have a son. He is made Prince of Wales, and everything looks great. So Richard has lost important members of his family. He's lost George, who was executed for treason. He's lost his brother, Edward, who died, but he's got his wife and he's got his son, and he has made his claim. He has set aside his nephews and his nieces' right to the throne. But so his family's getting a little smaller, but he's still hanging in there. Unfortunately, within a year, his son, also named Edward of Middleham, dies in 1484. And this is catastrophic. It's devastating personally. It's catastrophic dynastically, because one of the things that strengthened Richard's claim over his nephew was that he was an adult. We don't want another child on the throne. And he had an heir. Now he doesn't have an heir. Richard and Anne had had no other children. And so to lose their only son was just devastating. And he's been betrayed by his friends. Buckingham has risen up against him, and now his son is dead. So his power base is definitely shrinking. And less than a year after that, this is the gravesite of Anne Neville, and she dies in 1485. And so he's seeing his family get smaller and smaller, and these people who had been at the core of it. He and Edward were close. He and George were close. He's been married to Anne all these years. She's gone. His only son is gone. His best friends are gone. And so Richard's circle and his family is getting smaller and smaller. So in contrast to those battles that he had fought at his brother's side with cousins and others in support, when Richard fights in the Battle of Bosworth, and when I say he's fighting alone, I don't mean he's literally fighting alone. Of course, he has a whole royal army, but it's not his family anymore. His family members aren't fighting alongside him. His brothers are gone. His wife and his son are gone. And it must have been a very difficult thing to be fighting again for the throne, but to be doing so in such different circumstances. And of course, against all odds, Henry Tudor and his ragtag army of mercenaries defeats Richard's army, probably or in large part because Richard had seen Henry get a little bit separated and charged, thought he could just end the whole thing. Richard continues to fight valiantly even when he is surrounded, but he is killed at Bosworth. And according to legend and the records of the time, the coronet he had on his helmet fell off into a bush, and Stanley gives that to Henry Tudor, and Henry is on the battlefield proclaimed the King of England in 1485. He is claiming the Lancastrian line to the throne through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who is the descendant of John Beaufort, who is the son of John of Gaunt. So it goes right back to the Beauforts and John of Gaunt, right back to John of Gaunt, as so many things do. Now, Richard has really seen all elements and all parts of that wheel of fortune spinning. He's been on top, he's been on the bottom, it seems, and there were legends that his body was just thrown into the river and lost forever. And we don't know exactly, well, we didn't for a lot of years what happened. He was not buried with any honor, but there was one final spin of the wheel. And we do know that in 2012, an extraordinary discovery was made in Gloucester, and Greyfriars was found, and the remains of Richard III were found. And so in 2013, the DNA results confirmed that they were, in fact, Richard's remains. And in 2015, they were reinterred in a royal burial. And so this former king, so many years after his death, was buried as a royal at Leicester, and there is a huge visitor center now you can visit and think about this king who, cared so much about family, counted so much on his family, and ultimately ended up alone for many years, but has recently, the remains have been found and he has been given an honorable burial, and people are able to visit him. So that's my journey through time with Richard III, and to imagine a holiday dinner with all those people gathered around, all those family members, is just interesting to think about how important family was at the time to Richard, and how sad it was as his family diminished so much at the end that he was quite alone when he died. And hopefully, if you get a chance to visit, you will know that his remains have been found and cared for, and maybe you can see them if you go to Leicester. So thank you so much for joining me as we continue through this month and through the holidays. I hope everything is going well and you are having a happy history holiday season as we continue to shake up history together.